Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us and welcome. We'll give everyone just a moment or two to join. We'll just give folks one more minute. Thank you for your patience. All right, folks, we'll go ahead and jump in and get started. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Savannah Barrett. I use she, her pronouns, and I work for Art of the Rural as the Exchange Director. Art of the Rural is a national organization that works to advance rural culture and quality of life through relationships that connect communities, cultivate dialogue, and forward rural-urban exchange. As part of that work, I co-founded the Rural Urban Exchange 8 years ago in Kentucky, and I'm really grateful to have this opportunity to share that work with you and to hear from several of the organizers of our first expansion of the Rural Urban Exchange model to our friends in Minnesota. So welcome to all of you joining us from Minnesota. We're so excited about the Minnesota Rural Urban Exchange launching this summer. I would be I'm sorry. I'd love to thank some of the folks who brought us here today. So thank you for the National Endowment for the Arts for supporting RUX's Knowledge Building series, and to Art of the Rural Apple Shop and our Minnesota Rural Urban Exchange funding partners, which include the McKnight Foundation and the St. Paul and Minnesota Foundation. We also really want to share our gratitude to our webinar host, Ivy Brashear, who is a founding steering committee member of RUX in Kentucky, and to our Minnesota RUX panelists, Anna Claussen, Kathy Mouacheupao, Joseph Allen, Salma Ahmed, and Cheryl Hills. So thank you all so much for joining us. And of course, all of you in the audience, thank you for joining us today. You'll learn a little bit more about the Rural Urban Exchange model as we go through the course of the webinar today, but I just would like to share in brief. The Rural Urban Exchange began in Kentucky in 2014. So we are in our 8th year of evolving into Kentucky's premier creative leadership program. We are a statewide network, and we invest in strong personal relationships that bridge cultures, grow social capital, and unite diverse leaders towards common vision. More than 260 Kentuckians from 49 counties are part of the RUX network here, and we'll host our 20th community intensive and our 11th host community this year. Here in Minnesota, or over there in Minnesota, they're just about to announce their first Minnesota RUX cohort. This is a pilot year. They'll be traveling to 3 RUX communities, and I'd love to turn things over to the Minnesota RUX coordinator, Anna Claussen, to tell you a little bit about how it's working in Minnesota. So welcome, Anna.
Thanks, Savannah. Thank you to our hosts. Thank you to our Kentucky team who is really our models and those that we've looked to for so much wisdom. And thank you to the Minnesota Steering Committee for being here and all of the guests. I'm Anna Claussen. I'm the founder of Voices for Rural Resilience. I'm based here in Minneapolis, where I live with my family. And I'm a Minnesotan, born and raised. As I usually introduce myself, or sometimes introduce myself, I'm daughter of Catherine Claussen and Stan Claussen, which means to me that I come from a long line of stewards and caretakers, farmers and nurses, and arrive here with the fortune of being coordinator of the Rural Urban Exchange in the ethos of deeply caring about our landscape, our places we come from, and with Voices for Rural Resilience, focusing in on working on a suite of empathy building tools to connect more deeply across our communities and across our state. So really grateful to have had this opportunity to lead, to coordinate. That's a great place to start. With the RUX model is a distributed leadership model, so that I'm not captain of this ship, but really getting to grow and learn and commit alongside a great group of other Minnesota leaders. I'm just to share with you a little bit about high level of what the Rural Urban Exchange is and what we're learning it is as we go is, it's centered on this opportunity to grow relationship across divides and to do so in a way that builds more collaborative and connected states, the Commonwealth for Kentucky, and now in Minnesota, what that means for us as Minnesotans. And it's been fascinating for us to take this model of in-person long weekend exchanges and also flesh out in Minnesota what that means to all of us on the steering committee. And I will just read how we've framed it up of even being perhaps in the future more than just the weekend gatherings. And I think this is true to Kentucky. We see it as a movement of individual people who are deeply yearning for complex, full, authentic representation of one another. And that through exchange, this is the way that we can actively commit to addressing the challenges that are affecting our most distant neighbors as if they live next door to ourselves. So the RUX recipe is what we get to learn and bring forward. And some of those pieces, you should never probably lay out pieces of a recipe and not the whole thing, but I'm sure I will miss some of them. But the ones that are center and core to RUX is place-based experiences, what it means to be deeply reflective and spend time in each other's homes, hometowns, communities, and then choosing those places and those sites and acknowledging that meaning with our time together. Prioritizing diversity and inclusion and what that means from a standpoint of also prioritizing accessibility. And coming into that space, the way Kentucky has taught us of setting the tone for having tough, challenging conversations, but doing so with an ethic of love and care. And that emphasizing trust and vulnerability. We also see and feel through the Kentucky model, as we're putting it in practice, incorporating cultural and artistic expression. And what is the role of cultural bearers and artists in helping us embrace play and embrace other ways of seeing our neighbors and seeing the world around us. There's a piece of the recipe that we're excited to try on, which is the balance of curriculum time and some things that pieces of curriculum that we were really eager to learn from, and then unfacilitated time to be in place and to be together, to have social experiences together, to all be under one roof and in one place for an intensive period of time, and to sort of in some ways check out from our daily busy lives and be present with each other. And that means being present with people we didn't know yesterday. So I know that we're going to get some overview of the core curriculum from Ivy, but I'll just also say that we're excited as we look into this, because as a group of, I would say, steering committee members, we came together because we share passion around this shared ethos of RUX, immersive and exploratory play, relationships, and then the core principles of RUX, of being a culture of health, of equity, of respect, and vulnerability. And right now, I think more than ever, I'm focused in on so many of those principles, specifically are we well, and what is it to create a culture of health and more places for us as individuals and together collectively to be well and to be stronger and to address trauma and to have tough, challenging conversations and do so coming out the other side better for it. So I'm going to leave it at that until I'll share some more about where we're at in our initial launch and getting excited and ready for our first 2 pilots in community. I'll pass it back to you, Ivy.
Thank you, Anna. It's a great introduction. And I also just want to say thank you again to everyone who's joining us today. And also thank you to our wonderful panelists whom you're all going to hear from in just a moment. So I wanted to just take a little bit of time and talk about the RUX framework. And we call this framework the currency of connection. And at its root, RUX combines immersive experiences in extraordinary places and dialogues about what we learned there, which become the shared experiences among the participants who are a part of RUX. And we combine that with facilitated storytelling that encourages openness and vulnerability about our individual experiences. And as a result of combining these strategies under this currency of connection framework, RUX alumni report an improved capacity to affect change in their communities and an enhanced understanding of best practices for ethical community development. As RUX has grown over the years, the founding members in Kentucky really wanted to open this program up. We didn't want to just keep it to ourselves. And so we wanted to make sure that other places could also benefit from this framework that we had developed and had put into practice. And we really believe that other places and other communities and other people could really be changed in the same way that we have been by this unique way that RUX brings people together in community and in places to build real relationships that then make change happen. So we started with Minnesota. And this session, we're really going to focus on the expansion of RUX into Minnesota and what that experience has been like for all of the people on this panel today. They're going to tell you some stories about that and talk about how they have prepared for this cohort launch later this year and what it's been like to work through this currency of connection framework in the place where they are. So that's what we're going to learn today from folks. And we are going to start with our first narrative stage. And I'm going to actually pass it back to Anna so she can tell y'all a little bit more. So Anna, I'll pass it to you.
Thanks, Ivy. Yeah, I'll just high-level overview of what does it look like. I'll tell you that when I reached out to all these wonderful people, some of them that are here and the rest of our committee who's with us in spirit, it looked really different. It was spring of 2020, winter, spring of 2020. We were preparing to go to Kentucky and witness and observe, some of us, what a weekend was like. And then, the pandemic hit, and then we moved right to virtual space of being in relationship for many of us, or some of us, virtual space of meeting for the first time. And so that it's certainly, I will only mention what we intended to do, and then I'll speak to what happened, what was a year-long virtual digital learning exchange. But to get there, the invitations to the people who make up what we call our core connectors, our connectors or steering committee, I'll use it interchangeably, was really, I'm going to say, people that I admire individually. Some of them who I learned and met just at the time of this project, but they're a leadership group of people with a depth of experience, like vision, compassion, but really embodying this ethos of the rural urban exchange. And I value the commitment that they all sort of showed up with a yes, not necessarily certain to what they were saying yes to. And we began learning from Kentucky with monthly 2-hour digital virtual meetings. Kentucky providing 8 years of experience with these community intensives and case studies and a handbook for us to work through together. But alongside that was really the simultaneous work of building our own relationships and making this our own, learning from the culture and context of Kentucky and saying, well, what is our context and how is it similar and how is it different? We started doing some field scanning and mapping of gauging what opportunities exist here for holding and leading this type of space and this type of connection. I'll say we're really rich in opportunity here in Minnesota. We often get told that from our national partners, sometimes, with a look of that we are blessed with a lot of wonderful organizations creating leadership opportunities. But we still also were able to stand back and see where we felt like we could step into our role. And I think a piece of that is this very deliberate rural-urban conversation exchange. And the challenging, tougher conversations that are existing within our communities and across our state, and what that looks like to be focused on the whole self, the personal self versus perhaps a professional role that you play, and to building out more opportunities for people who may not find themselves in the more traditional sectors, nonprofit and NGO, government sectors, community development, where they're in these circles and having this conversation. How do we branch that out and make it even more diverse and more accessible? And so the third piece will just, from a story standpoint of what it was like to honor the times we were in during a pandemic, also at the really heart of racial reckoning, starting here in Minneapolis as we kicked off. It meant that we really needed to assess together what we needed to get out of this time. Yes, we were learning, and we moved from group learning into triads and into a mentorship role with the Kentucky team of understanding the curriculum on a deeper level. But we also were creatively learning how to co-navigate and be in relationship in an entirely different way. Because they had to recognize that this group of steering committee members were our leaders in our communities. And that means we're always holding up their communities, their families. And it was a very vulnerable time to commit to another layer of physical and emotional work that I think involves in creating something like this. So I was very grateful for the commitment. I am very grateful. And I think we really reassessed throughout the year of what it means to still be valuable, and created a plan that was about spiritual and relationship and belonging as much as it was about information exchange. And then the third piece being, I can't say we're successful at this because it's a really hard one, but what did it mean to build momentum and keep momentum as we were just sort of waiting to know, when will it feel right and safe to be in person and to gather people together? And those were challenging things to hold, but I'm grateful for a committee who showed up anyways, because they're a group of passionate, driven members of their community who say, this type of connection matters, and I'm ready to play my role in creating a new opportunity for others. Ivy, back to you.
Thank you so much for that perspective. It's valuable, so valuable to hear about how y'all started this out and how you have journeyed through it to this point now. And with that in mind, I would love to turn it over to Kathy so that you can tell us all about your experience so far with this process.
Yeah. Good afternoon if you're in the central time, but a good day to everyone that's here. Thank you, Anna, for that backdrop, because I think that really contextualizes and it was like a really nice backdrop for like the way that I've been thinking about my experience. And so my name is Kathy Mouacheupao. I use she, her pronouns. I live in St. Paul. I consider myself totally a St. Paul girl, St. Paulite. But but I was born in Newton, Massachusetts, right? So, and I'll talk a little bit about that. I currently have the honor of being the executive director of the Metropolitan Regional Arts Council. And so I'm a part of an 11 regional arts council system in the state of Minnesota. We are essentially a grant maker. We get about 95% of our funding comes from the state. And so we get to support the vibrant arts community in Minnesota, really to make Minnesota the best place that we can live, right? It is such an honor to be in that role. And in many ways, or in some ways, that's part of like what was really exciting for me when I got the invitation to be a part of this. I was going back through like all of my emails because I wanted to like, I was trying to reflect and think about like what happened, you know, like it's been kind of weird. I'll be real honest, right? Like what happened in these last 2 years? How did we actually get to this point? You know, like, May 20th, 2020, that was the first email that I got from Savannah, and Anna was on that. And so Savannah and I had met through another program just like not too long ago, pre-pandemic, but not too long before this. And it was basically just like, hey, Kathy, how are you doing? You know, like, it's a wild time in the world, absolutely. But, you know, I wanted to invite you to be a part of this new idea of bringing the rural urban exchange to Minnesota. And so I was like, okay, what is this? What is this RUX thing? What is this Kentucky RUX thing? So this is my response. This is my actual response in that email. I said, this is so timely because we're talking more about rural urban realities among regional arts councils in Minnesota and trying to better understand what solidarity might look like. I went to the RUX site and now I'm wondering about interdependence. I'm not exactly clear about what the ask is, but I'm interested. And from there, you know, like now we have a cohort, we've got some like ideas. I'll say that this has been being a part of Minnesota RUX, or, you know, this development has been one of the most unique, spacious, emergent, sometimes frustrating, but always nutritious like experiences I've ever had. You know, it's so centered around relationships. And, you know, I've met people that I never would have met otherwise, and I've never met them in person. And so there's just like, there's so many added layers. But I think at the heart of it, you know, it's also been kind of a soul searching, identity searching. It's been very, very personal for me, as well as professional, right? So like my initial response was really based on my professional experience, what's happening with the regional arts councils. You know, we serve our individual regions, but really, I think our power is in how we can collectively as a system serve the state. And, you know, people look at the metro, like the urban city slicker people, you know, like they're within my region, there are rural communities, right? And like, I think it's part of my responsibility to really understand like how to engage and how to serve those communities. And it's also my responsibility to know either when the metro is like sucking resources, or how we can also give, you know, and how to be in relationship with our partners throughout the state. I mean, you know, my ancestors were all rural people, right? I was the first American born child to Hmong refugees. And so, you know, like Hmong people, historically, we don't have a country. And so we've always had to be in relationship with the land and the people that we're immersed with. And so, you know, I think that like, it's been very comfortable to be in St. Paul because we have the highest concentration of Hmong people. This is home to the highest concentration of Hmong people in the country. And so oftentimes I forget what a privilege that is to grow up in a city where I'm surrounded by people from my culture. And so I don't necessarily feel that safe outside of St. Paul. And this was an opportunity for me to kind of like figure that out. So here we are. I'm excited. Just quickly, I know that my time is like running out, but I'll just say that, you know, we've chosen the Frogtown Rondo neighborhoods in St. Paul as the kind of the location, the community that we'll be spending our intensive times in. Just really briefly, you know, I think that decision was really made because it's got such an incredibly rich culture and history. It's also, you know, because of the important history, it's been home to immigrants over time, but also a historic African-American community that was devastated by the development of I-94. And so it's really, I think there's so many stories, powerful stories about trauma, but also resilience and how the community has come together and has loved each other. And so I'm super excited about figuring out what's next.
Thank you, Kathy. That was great. I love hearing the way that you describe it. This is a complex thing, right? And it is about personal, and it's about those connections that you make and the stories that you share. So I appreciate you sharing that with us. So next, I would love to turn it over to Joseph Allen to talk a little bit about what it was like to think about this cohort, this initial cohort that y'all are bringing in, and what that process was like. So I will turn it over to you, Joe.
Oh, thanks, Ivy. So I'm Joe Allen, he, him. I live on the White Earth Nation up here in northern Minnesota. We are the largest tribal nation in Minnesota. There's 11 tribal nations here in Minnesota. I think that's something that's kind of unique for from the RUX model. In terms of Kentucky, there are no tribal nations. So yeah, I was on the selection committee, but I'm also was on the host committee because we're also the second community that the rural community that our first cohort will meet. And so and I was just looking at statistics, you know, and it was like Mahnomen County, which is the county which I work in and which is entirely within the White Earth Nation, has the highest diversity index in Minnesota of all the counties. The next one is Ramsey County, which is basically St. Paul. And so, but you know, we're only 5,000 people in our county, so we're very rural, and we're half of our population is Native, enrolled in the White Earth Nation. So yeah, you know, and I was just looking at my email because I got invited on July 1st, 2020. So it was like tomorrow's our 2-year anniversary from meeting Anna. And so I got invited by Eric Takashita, who I knew back from another leadership, the Creative Community Leadership Institute. I met him in 2012 in Fargo. And so I'm closer to Fargo than I am to the Twin Cities. So that's how I got connected, and then I met with Anna, and so we, you know, I just try to think of how all this process. So, you know, I went through COVID during that time, you know, the early stage. I got in November of 2020, and right when we were finishing up the exchange with the Kentucky people, and so my, you know, and so then. Fast forward, we went live with our application. I think it was in early May. I mean, so we had a very short window of time to get people to get applications in. And so we had extended over I think we did it over the Memorial Day weekend. We extended it to like Tuesday or Monday or something. But even with that short window, we got 43 apps, which I think is tremendous. What we had, you know, there was no name recognition here in Minnesota for Minnesota RUX. So I think that was amazing. And I think that came reading through the apps is like, they were all connected. Most of them were connected to people on the steering committee. So that was the biggest way that we were able to get people to apply. It's just like, hey, you know, I sent it to 4 people and one of them applied, or no, 3 of them applied, I think. So, and you know, so that's the way we got it. And so, and we're looking at that mix. So we, you know, I'm not sure how RUX does it, but you know, we're only going to start with 15 at this time. And so we're trying to do this staggered start where this first year will be the first 15, and then we'll add some more next year, and then keep it going on this 2-year cycle. And we'll see how that plays out. But so we were able to select, we did really short. I think we only had like a week to read all 43 apps. There was like 4 of us on the committee, myself, someone from Duluth, and someone from St. Paul, and some from Winona, which is in the southern part of Minnesota, the southeastern part. And so, yeah, we met on a Monday night, like 6 o'clock, and we hashed it out. And so I think it's been announced now. I'm not sure, but at least people have told me they've gotten accepted. So that I know. And so that's cool. And then just a little bit about where we're up here, in terms of northern Minnesota. We were able to land our site as at the Itasca Biological Station, which is a really beautiful spot in Lake Itasca, which is the headwaters of the Mississippi. So we have the whole facility to ourselves for that weekend intensive. So it's going to be a really great weekend. So I'm looking forward to go down to St. Paul too. So.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that. Yeah, that's a quick turnaround on selection of the cohort, but it's really great to hear that you had such interest. And like you said, with very little name recognition. So that's super encouraging. I'm excited for y'all to bring all those folks in. So now we would love to hear from Salma about your experience as a Minnesota RUX fellow, and being a younger person who's involved in this, and just what that means for you and why you wanted to be involved.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you all so much for hosting this incredible space. I feel really honored to be here. I like to start a lot of my conversations with folks, especially if it's a diverse audience. I like to start it off with just acknowledging that I'm calling from Minneapolis, which is, stolen Dakota land first and foremost, home to vibrant communities of color, vibrant communities just in general, and definitely a place that I feel incredibly connected to. So the place for me, so my name is Salma Ahmed, and I got introduced to RUX, I believe at the beginning of this year through Anna. And if any of y'all know Anna personally, you know that it's very easy to follow her anywhere and to be in community with her and to follow her incredible lead always. So for me, it was kind of a no-brainer when I was first invited by her and to join this program or to be a part of this program. I remember in the initial email that she wrote to me, she gave like specific, what is it called? Like specific, like stories she brought up of like reasons why I would be good for something like this. And that's a testament to the kind of person that Anna is, and how she always leads with her heart and kindness. So Anna, I love you, and I would follow you to the ends of the earth always. So you can count on me for that. But yeah, I feel really grateful to be in this space because I got to meet incredible folks like Kathy and Joe, who I haven't met in person, and it's going to be so cool and so weird to like see everybody because in my head there are just computer screens, but they're also like really amazing people with incredible stories. So yeah, it's just an honor to again be a part of something as wonderful as this. And for me, I work in a national nonprofit called Lead for America. And what that is essentially is it is a program that places young leaders across the country in specific rural and urban communities to work on the country's toughest challenges. So even though I grew up in Minneapolis and in St. Paul, both the Twin Cities area, I ended up choosing rural Minnesota as like my placement site for the kind of work that I wanted to do. It wasn't necessarily about the location, it was more about the work that intrigued me. So I get to work on mental health initiatives in a community that is really deserving of support, you know, resources, financial, social capital, other things. And so I get to work and kind of move the needle forward in that incredible work every day. And I get to work with youth and people who are super passionate about their place and about their community. And I've been there, because I'm not currently there, but I've been there for the last 2 years, right after the murder of George Floyd, right after the racial uprising. And that was a very difficult decision for me because another identity that I have is, you know, being an organizer, being an activist. And so leaving my community right when I felt like my community needed me the most was not an easy decision at all. But I felt comfortable with, you know, I felt like the community was in good hands with like the people who I had spent years building connections with. And I, you know, felt like I can still do the back and forth travel thing. Like it's going to be all right. I'm not like too far away where like I'm completely off the grid. So that helped make my decision a lot easier. But as far as, you know, what RUX means to me and why I'm here, I would say I spent my whole life teetering between several identities, honestly, not feeling, you know, Black enough for some people, feeling too Black for others, feeling, you know, too Muslim, and just kind of navigating with that, what that intersectional lens looks like. And so, you know, I think that like one thing that I can say about having lived experience in a rural community now for 2 years and in an urban community, I never really felt like Minnesota was my home. It felt like just a place that I lived because I didn't feel safe outside of the metro area, outside of the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. As Kathy mentioned beautifully, Minnesota is home to the largest concentration of Hmong you know, folks in the country. It's also the largest Somali population outside of Somalia. So I always felt like I had this like enclave of like support and encouragement with people who looked like me. And yes, there was still racism. Yes, there were still issues, but it felt like a safe space for me. So when I moved to rural Minnesota, I was like the only person that looked like me, and I was the only person that people knew that looked like me. So it was a challenge, but joining RUX, and I know I'm like a little bit over time, so I will wrap it up. But for me, joining RUX was so important because, you know, the currency of social capital, like y'all talk about, is not, for me, it's not even a question, right? Belonging is not only necessary, but it's absolutely critical. It's part of our livelihood, especially for people with very visible identities. Our very safety depends on it. So for me, it wasn't a question. And so I'm looking forward to building more connections. I'm looking forward to building more social capital with folks across the country and finally feeling like Minnesota can, you know, be my home. I'm not there all the way yet, but I'm hoping that I will be through this program and through other things. So yeah, thank you all so much. And I will pass it back to you, Ivy.
Thank you so much. I love that about belonging being essential. I think that's very true. So thank you so much for sharing about your experience so far. And I have a feeling it's going to get better from here as y'all get started and start traveling around. All right, so now I want to pass it over to Cheryl, who is going to speak to us a little bit more about that rural Minnesota perspective and just give her insights about the potential for this work in Minnesota. So Cheryl, I'll pass it over.
Thanks, Ivy, and salute to Salma and Kathy and Joe. Wow, you're just so inspiring, and I just want to give you all hugs because this is a really fun time. Thanks for all of you who joined as well and for this opportunity. I am Cheryl Hills, go by she, her pronouns, and I live and work in central Minnesota, 5 counties and rural. Lived in urban places across the country. This is my home, and I love rural. I'm a rural advocate. an untraditional leader. And yeah, mom, and my favorite title is Grammy, and that's the one I'm holding forever. I'm also a RUX professional and personal rower, as Anna started this conversation. The first email that I received was really cool, Kathy, that you brought that up, was in February 2020. I had to look it up too, Joe, to say when it was. And that was not my first introduction to RUX. Savannah and I took a trip way back many years ago when RUX was an incubator in her mind, and we had a long car ride together and talked a lot about what distributed leadership looks like and how can that work in rural and urban. And I'm so proud of the work that y'all have done in Kentucky. Just really proud. You know, when Anna and Savannah asked me to speak about my rural perspective and offer potential about this work, as Ivy said, for the future, I was telling Savannah about a recent experience where I had the privilege of testifying to the House Select Committee at Congress on economic disparities, fairness, and growth. And it was around a hearing on place-based economic development that happened in May. And, you know, that I was telling Savannah that experience really reduced my already depleting confidence in elected officials to bridge any sort of difference whatsoever, and to really think about what places need, urban and rural, right? And somehow how policies are intended, good intentions really, pardon my language, screw up. They just don't hit the mark, right? So I was thinking about that and how that differs from what I've experienced with RUX, and that how, while I believe many of the RUX members thus far that I've met, who are some of the coolest people on the planet, by the way, are kind of like-minded. There's a lot of like minds there. I think that there's still this urban-rural bridging has been fascinating and is so needed in Minnesota. I love what one of the RUX cohort members said in Kentucky, that this is leadership through relationship, and that is how we think, right? That's at our core. Know that that's what makes a difference. And I love that RUX brings that different lived experiences of those urban and rural life experiences to the table, and different gender experiences and racial differences. That through relationship is something that we don't get really anywhere else, not unless it's laden with a whole lot of, like, sometimes academia, theory and exercises. This is really more about relationship. And RUX gives me hope to reduce that polarization that has been told to us exists between rural and urban. Now, that said, I'm at a point in my life where I'm leaning into polarization on topics. One, because I'm mad and I'm tired and I'm old and I'm sick of the crap. So I'm leaning into polarization on some of the topics, but I am also leaning into bridging difference of people that have different mindsets and I have different experiences. And so that's what RUX has given to me. And I think it offers to a lot of people, is that it can meet you where you're at in your journey of trying to have relationships with humans, right? And still in a way that doesn't jeopardize or doesn't leave behind my desire to still be very passionate and an advocate for injustices. And so that's important. The only other thing I really want to share, because I'm excited to hear any questions that are coming from folks, is that as part of the planning committee, which I'm very honored to have been part of this planning committee for RUX in Minnesota, we had a meeting in, I don't even remember what town we were in. Maybe we were in Winona, but no, it wasn't. It was the other W. Where were we at? It was Waseca. We were in Waseca. And I recall sitting out by the lake, looking at the lake on a picnic table with one of the planning committee meetings, Cassie Williams, who I didn't know before this, right? I didn't know her lived experience. I didn't know who she was. I didn't know what she valued or didn't, but it was so beautiful sitting on that picnic table and just looking at the lake. And I don't even recall us talking all that much, but we were just together as people. And in that piece, we met each other, right? And that was really, really, it's hard to explain, but very beautiful. And I think more experiences like that amongst humans is what will allow us to have those conversations. Now, I wouldn't hesitate to call Cassie and say, Cassie, I'm struggling with something, and I really think you can help me with it. That is the bridging that can happen, that is so powerful for RUX, and why I'm excited to continue to lean in as a rower in whatever way they need me. Thanks, Abby.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that. All right, so we are running just a little bit behind on our planned agenda, but I did want to give just a couple minutes space for anyone on the panel who wants to speak to this, but several of you have sort of nodded to it a little bit, that you planned all of this and did all of this in a pandemic where a lot of your time, couldn't be in person. And RUX is such a personal experience, even the planning of it and, the prep for it. And I would love to just hear, maybe just like one of y'all who's willing to speak to it, what that was like, what that experience was like, trying to replicate this relationship driven process in the middle of a pandemic where, you couldn't always be together face to face. So if anyone wants to speak to that, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say briefly, there was nothing natural about it. I mean, but I think that the thing about the pandemic was that we were all experiencing it at the same time, right? Like we were all experiencing some level of crisis. And so that was like shared and collective. And then I think, this has just been a big, huge love fest too, right? And it always is when we get together, which is I think what like keeps bringing me back to, but it's like, we're all people that really care and rely and value relationships. That's at the core of what RUX is. And so it was like, okay, we're all in a pandemic, we're all in a crisis, we're all like trying to figure out what to do, but like, it was like an anchor for all of us, So how do we figure out how to be in relationship with new people and some old people that probably like Salma was saying about Anna, similar with me, right? It was Anna, my new relationship with Anna, and a pretty new relationship with Savannah that really was like, okay, I'll do it, But it was like being in a space with a bunch of people where we're all trying to figure out how to do this thing that we all care about was really kind of cool, and like was kind of like what kept it going, right? So it wasn't just like yeah, so I'm like, okay, I care about relationships, I'm trying to figure out how to be in relationships with people in a virtual world, trying to figure out how to be virtual, but so are all these other people, you know what I mean? So that was really it was helpful in the midst of everything else, because you're also like virtually in spaces with people that don't care about relationships. And that's hard. So it was helpful to have this group of people to kind of like figure it out with. And then we're also like doing this cool like role, it's like, and then there's like the work, but the commitment to relationships, I think, really kept things going.
Yeah, that's great.
Ivy, I have
Yeah.
one.
Sure, go ahead.
Kathy, you just reminded me of this in your sharing. I think before the pandemic, before this shared experience, also of the murder of George Floyd and the racial uprising, I think it was even more amplified what it was to have our stories and our narratives and our perspectives written and mostly consumed through media. We were so isolated in this way, and it was a place to process how we were viewing and being viewed as a rural, urban, as communities, as people through these times, and our shared pain and shared suffering, and also what sometimes just gets written as our differences without spaces to process it. So I was personally extremely grateful for the container of RUX and the steering committee to be in that, not always talking about it, but at least being present fully with what we were holding in a shared space that reinforced to me sometimes what needed to counter narratives that particularly were coming across media headlines for me about each other.
Yeah, that's a really, that really resonates. You know, we in Kentucky, we certainly were not dealing with the murder of George Floyd and some of the media stories that y'all were having, but we are familiar with a lot of stories being told about us. And so I'm grateful to you for bringing that up. And, you know, I would just love to hear from others too about like this and, you know, planning this in the pandemic and maybe like what you are learning from this process so far, these kinds of interesting tidbits that you're taking away that some of y'all have already shared. And yeah, just I'd love to hear from each of you just a little bit about that. Like, what are you learning so far, and how has this impacted you so far? And I know some have already mentioned that, but I'd love to hear more.
Maybe riffing on what Kathy and Anna said a little bit in that one of the things, Ivy, that I've learned is to, you know, after the murder of George Floyd and the social reckoning and what was happening. And Kathy said something one time at one of our early meetings that she said, she was very, and she said it here today too, that she was sometimes apprehensive, if not fearful, of being in some rural places, especially where there were signs that made her feel much more dangerous. And it's a dangerous environment. And, you know, her words rang through me and I thought, dang, if we don't tell our story in rural, somebody else is going to. And those perceptions, I don't know that they're not true, to tell you the truth. And so that started, I know Savannah mentioned that some growers or other folks in Kentucky had also said it changed how they thought about their work as well. Likewise, that's when I picked up the phone and started calling folks and saying, we need to start a justice system consortium and thinking about what's happening with in communities of color and Indian country with our law enforcement and how that is interfacing. What is that narrative that's coming out of the urban place and the stereotypes about rural true? And that caused me to work differently by listening to the testimony and the real vulnerable, legitimate concerns that RUX members had. Caused me to ask different questions and do work differently, and that's powerful. And so I'm learning. I mean, I try to listen anyway, but I think it's listening to the different perspectives of non-dominant culture folks that are coming to my communities and experiencing it very differently than I am, and that was powerful.
Thank you for sharing that. Joe, I see you're off mute.
Yeah, I was just gonna try to say something.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think like thinking about COVID and, you know, this virtual world, it's like, for me living in the rural, you know, it's 4-hour drive for me to go to Minneapolis. And so if this had been done, you know, I just think it just kind of sped things up, you know, in terms of like, we were able to show up at meetings and not like, I missed one meeting that I think that's where they elected Mahnomen as the host committee. So, but down in Waseca, I didn't make the first in-person one. I didn't make it, you know, because that's like a 5-hour drive for me. So it was like, but so I think, you know, and I've been able to connect with so many more people, not just in the RUX, but with other, you know, things in my work, and it's kind of sped things up in terms of relationships, you know, in terms of people, you know, working for the wider tribe, you know, trying to connect to an urban market, you know, that has really helped me this time of, you know, COVID. You know, if there's one thing that I've learned, you know, is like that learning how to connect with people and not necessarily it has to be, you know, in person all the time. And so, and be willing to get on the Zoom and, you know, and meet people. And so I've met a lot of people, and I've met Cheryl and Kathy just briefly at certain things, but we never really spent much time, you know, and but to be able to spend like a whole year on these meetings, it's just, really intensive getting to know people. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think for me, being a part of the St. Paul host committee, I've learned in such a like profound, almost like, I don't know, kind of like a life epiphany kind of way. I've learned that for communities so for our St. Paul host, like I should just give some context probably before I jump into the story. We want to make sure as many communities are represented within the St. Paul community, St. Paul Rondo, like Frogtown community. So, you know, Kathy's been really great about like connecting with historically the like trying to lift up like that, the African-American community that has been there historically for a very long time. We want to try to get the Hmong community represented, the Somali community and others. And so for me, I've been trying my best to reach out to the Somali community there, and you know, which is my community, like I'm a part of that as well. But it's like sometimes when I'm making these asks, I kind of feel like an outsider just because there's so much apprehension, right? With like, and I think that speaks a lot to a little bit of what Cheryl was speaking about earlier, that it speaks to the trauma of communities that have been heavily policed, heavily surveilled, have dealt with a lot of things, you know, a lot of societal ills, and still persevered through that, right? But I think one of the side effects of that is that like there's apprehension, and so it's hard to get folks to like commit to things like this. So I've had a lot of conversations with community members that are like, RUX sounds really cool in theory, but I don't know how I feel about opening up to a bunch of strangers from across the state about stuff that's going on internally within us. I'd rather like we just do our own thing and we just kind of deal with it. And so I've been lovingly and gently like trying to tell them like, no, I understand that for a lot of us in this work, myself included, visibility equals danger sometimes, right? But then at the same time, it's two sides of the same coin, right? So visibility can equal danger, but then at the same time, when you are lifting up some of that burden with a broader community, or like more allies and more folks are tapped into what you're doing, and you're just building strong relationships and connections in that social capital, I think that can make for a less lonely, less isolating experience. And so I try to like, you know, offer that wisdom or offer some of those tidbits, but it's hard, especially with the elders. Like it's really hard. And I have so much love for my elders because they've literally been paving the way for generations before me. But so it's kind of like I'm in this space right now of like, how do I get my folks to engage with my other folks, right? So I'm just kind of in that space right now. And so I'd be really curious to know if any of the other if anyone else in the room and in the Zoom space has dealt with that, and like even if there's like a Kentucky context to that, and like what that means for like how you continue to build relationships despite some of those challenges. I know that's a very deep question. I just threw that in there. But it's something I'm like, that's heavy on my mind. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question. I wonder if any of the Minnesota folks want to respond or have an answer.
I could share a little bit from the Kentucky perspective. For one thing, you know, it's always more challenging when you're starting with a community. In Kentucky, we work with each host community for 2 years. And that first year is in some ways really just about asking the community to think a little bit differently about their community story, about who tells that story. You know, in the first year that we work with folks, we might, you know, be asking like, there are many narratives in every community, and that diversity is the richness that we seek. And so if we hear conflicting narratives, that's exciting, right? Because that's the truth. And it gives people an opportunity to question what they came in with. So it's okay if we hear two different stories of your community. That's great. That's what we're looking for. It's also the role of RUX as an organization to sometimes challenge a community to think more broadly about who's at the table and who gets to be a part of sharing that community story. And so there's always a bit of push and pull, right? There's that desire for us to hear really broad perspectives. And there's the desire on the part of the community to tell a beautiful story about a place that they love. And so we always have to push to say, we want to hear about the good, the bad, and the ugly, because the challenges that you're facing are probably aligned with the challenges that other folks across the state are facing. They may not know that their challenge also has a root in your community. They may not know that you've come up with a solution that's working here that they could try there, or vice versa. And so for us to all get together, for us to find interdependence, for us to find ways to work together on common challenges, or to replicate ideas that are working really beautifully in communities across the state that we don't know anything about, we have to build real trust and relationships. And that happens when you tell the truth, right? That doesn't happen when you have the glossy version of what your community is doing. And so what I have found is that there's a lot of apprehension in that first year of working with the community. And that's just because you haven't put the time in. You've got to build the relationships. They need to see it happen. They need to build that trust, both with RUX as an organization in the cohort and within their own committee. Because there isn't, we take it for granted, especially in small communities, that everyone who's coming together to design these experiences has trust among themselves. And that's not always the case. So, we have found that planning RUX in your community is often an act of self-discovery, that folks frequently meet one another for the first time, or meet one another in vastly different ways than they're normally meeting each other, right? Like the process of hosting RUX is very different than working on fiscal court together. And you'll find that you know each other differently. So I think I would just encourage y'all to be patient and to keep showing up, and to sort of make the promise to these communities that you work in that this won't be the last they see of you. That it's a long-term commitment to being a part of the network. And what I've found is when you bring the values of RUX into the process, and when you show up with respect and listening and curiosity, and a real willingness to go a step further than the conversation you have, that pays dividends, and that folks lean in. And in the second year, you can have conversations that folks in that first year would have thought they would never have with you. And that some of those folks will end up signing up for the cohort themselves, and that, it just builds over time. And that's the currency of connection, right? You've got to put the time in, you've got to build trust with folks, and you have to be willing to put your own biases and perspectives aside on every issue. Take a deep breath and figure out how to approach a conversation with someone you consider opposing, or someone you may be fearful of for very good reason. You have to find a way to open yourself up to really hear from them and find their humanity. And everyone's changed anytime anyone does that. And that's the potential, but it's some of the hardest work I've ever been a part of. So it's also a really amazing opportunity for all of you as you build these really strong relationships in the core to care for one another in that process. Turning it back over to Minnesotans.
Thanks, Savannah. And thanks, Salma, for bringing up, I think, a really, and articulating really well what is a hard tension to hold. I don't have wisdom or insight. I just have a reflection that I feel like, from my own experience, well, 2 points. I think for me personally, I identify both rural and urban. And it's an interesting thing when I'm looking and sort of flipping that coin and sort of still trying to draw a connection, but also understanding that, for example, if I take my own home community, the community I still call home, a small rural town, I think others sometimes perceive that there is one narrative, there is one shared story. And sometimes as occasionally coming in being an insider outsider, I've experienced that people can tell me their different narratives, their different stories that may conflict, just like you say, Savannah, that then it means it's true, it's more complex, it's more real, easier than they can talk to each other as like current living neighbors. And so I'm interested in RUX and the opportunity it brings, where it's challenging to invite people to share with people outside of your community, your dirty laundry, so to speak, you know, your challenges, your tensions. But I've also seen it prove to be a good pathway for conversations that have been hard to have within communities. And that's not, I know, Salma, directly what you're speaking to. But the other piece I reflect on is that there's so much healing in hearing and truly holding somebody else's story. But I can speak personally that I have a lot more experience doing that one-on-one and the healing that can happen there, but not as a community. And I think we need more community healing spaces where it is not just a single story, it is these multiple stories, and you're figuring out how to hear, hold multiple stories, multiple truths, and have it still hopefully be a healing process like I've experienced it to be one-on-one, but less so when you add in more complexities. So I'm inspired and intrigued by the potential, but I'm not naive enough to step aside and know that that's also where the hard stuff sits and is. Time to lean in, I guess. But
I want to just add on to that, Anna, that I think I agree, and it's all beautiful language, and that this bridging is important, and it is finding that space and that peace, and that is euphoric, right? Like, this is all very, very good. But Joe and I were talking about this yesterday on the Mahnomen planning team committee, and Teresa and yourself, Anna, this. That doesn't mean just because I want to bridge difference and understand difference that I need to adopt, or I need to assimilate into a way of thinking. It's not bridging, right? Assimilation is different than bridging. And so while I think it is so important to be able to bridge difference, and I've been working on that for much of my career and years, there right now, and it's partially where the country is in my age and what's happening at the federal level and to our communities, and knowing how these decisions are going to hurt people that I care about. I will try to bridge, but there are populations that I just, that are more difficult now than ever before. And so the skills that we learn through RUX are important to be able to bridge that difference and understand the humanness and where we're all coming from, and that beautiful language that you and Savannah just spew out so wonderfully out of your pores. But there are some folks right now, I understand that I just I don't have to bridge that anymore. And that wasn't where I was a year ago. And I think the RUX experience has taught me that it's okay to ebb and flow through those feelings. And it's okay to have that understanding that right now, that polarization on issues that I know are truly going to cause what I call reproductive slavery is not a place I'm really willing to have to, as Savannah said, to just listen and be into that space. I can hear it, but in my core, it's vile, right? And so I just want to state that while all this bridging is beautiful and it's happening, that doesn't necessarily mean that I have to change my value system upon understanding where those other groups of folks and ways of thinking and value systems sit. And that's just my observation about RUX, is that it can be a beautiful thing, but it also can be an understanding about where we are and where we won't shift.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I mean, even earlier when you were saying you're leaning into the polarization, I mean, I'm like, yeah, and I think, when you were talking about something I had said in the past, which I was like, oh, yeah, people actually pay attention, so like, be careful what you say, Kathy. but I don't remember if that was a part of a conversation we've been having. I mean, so much of this is experimental for me personally, right? So like part of my personal growth in this process is like accepting the experiment, you know, because what keeps coming up for me is like, and this is not to say that everybody in rural is this, but if you look at voting maps, and if you know, I mean, like, my parents live in South Carolina now, so we've been driving down. I mean, there's lots of things, and not to totally grossly generalize, but that feeling of like lack of safety is based on actual experiences, right, of hostility. You know, is based on, you know, signage, you know, of messages that like tell me I'm not welcomed, you know, lots of things, right? So like, I remember once having a conversation with folks in the steering committee, and I can't remember what the rest of the context was, but I was just like, okay, so everybody in this space like politically aligns, and like we share values, right? And a lot of what we're talking about is like creating the space for where that's not always the case. So what actually happens, and I think I was asking Kentucky RUX this, like what actually happens when you have people that are on opposite ends of like a political ideologies? Because I mean, this, you know, we can't take the politicalness out of all of this, right? Like everything, it feels like it just like comes down to political issues, especially right now. And so what happens when that happens? And I think, I love the way you just stated it though. I mean, like it sounds euphoric to be like, we're gonna get to a place where we can work through that. And that's hard. I mean, and I don't know. I mean, I'm like I said, I'm open to the experiment of it. I don't know how it'll turn out. Because, you know, I had to turn off the radio. I had to like kind of like remove myself from like everything that I was hearing, because I really was like, if I can't even hear a statement that supports what the Supreme Court just, you know, I can't even hear it, you know? So I think that we'll see what happens when we get everybody in the room. And what is the outcome of forming these new relationships, or, you know, what does that bridge look like, right? Like in our St. Paul host group, we actually talked about the bridge not being the right kind of metaphor. Is the bridge what we're trying to build? And I can't remember the details of that conversation, but it was a really good one. Salma and Anna, I don't know if you want to bring anything else into that, but I think a lot of this is kind of figuring out, though, for me personally, like, how do I think about coexisting, right? For my own kind of like health and preservation of like peace in my body and my soul. You know, what does it look like to actually exist with each other? And it's not to say that it will be pleasant, but it's about like building my own mechanisms of how to cope with it and how to deal with it, and how do I like create some way to feel safe when I'm not immersed in the biggest Hmong population, you know, because there's, you know, so like, yeah. What I will also say, what I think is like been on my mind as I think about like bringing people into Frongtown, Rondo, and Little Mekong, which is a business district, a Southeast Asian little business district, is just like, how do we, I don't want to set people up to have to be performative or be on display. So I think there's this really delicate part that I'm trying to work through and figure out around like, how do we share our communities and our culture and, you know, things that we're dealing with authentically, I guess, is just like, right? Because I think it can easily become performative or feel like we're on display, or, you know, I don't know. I mean, we can't control how people are going to walk away from these experiences, or what ideas they're going to form. in their minds. So I just want to be able to like be a part of creating the conditions where people can feel confident and safe to share their experiences and their stories, whatever the outcome is, I guess.
Thank you all for having this conversation. It's an incredibly important one. It's good that you're wrestling with all of this and trying to figure it out, and, you know, trying to create this space that feels right and good for y'all. I want to just note a couple things. The chat, if y'all are not seeing the chat, please go to the chat. There's some good stuff happening there to be seen. Also want to note that we have about 15 minutes or so left in this webinar. And I would love to just open it up for questions from the folks attending, or questions among yourselves. Like this conversation of, you know, these questions and still wrestling with this stuff is really powerful to witness. So I will just open it up for questions from anyone. You can put them in the chat as well. And I can go ahead and start us off with a question, just sort of leading off of this conversation that y'all just had, and some of what you were saying, Kathy. But I'm just wondering, you know, you all are preparing for this first gathering of the cohort that you've brought together or will bring together. And I just wonder, you know, what are some of the things that you're hoping for out of that experience for those folks that you're bringing in, and also for yourselves as being the people who are helping to plan this? What do you hope for? And there's also a question here that in the chat that Savannah's shared that I think also kind of goes along with this. What do you hope is different in Minnesota as a result of this work? And how do you hope to be changed in the process?
I'm sorry, I feel like I'm taking up a lot of space, but I'm just gonna say it while it's on my mind. And it's gonna be really, really blunt. You know, not to pat myself on the back or anything. Like, I feel like I'm an incredibly accepting person. I love people. I like what Savannah was saying, like this idea of like just opening yourself up to people's humanities. I feel like I do that all the time. And I feel like it doesn't happen to me. I feel like it doesn't happen to my people. I feel like it doesn't have, like, oh my God, I'm getting emotional. But like, I hope to change other people's minds. I hope that they can like be as accepting, you know. I hope that they can like start to see the humanity in me, you know, because I feel like that's the problem, right? I'm like, yo, I'm just trying to live, just trying to do my thing, trying to figure out who I am, why I care about the things I care about, you know. So like, yeah, I open my heart to the humanity in this world, to other people. And like, I really hope that this experience can duplicate that, you know, many folds, right? So for everybody out there that can't find that in their heart, I hope that RUX can start to plant those seeds. I did not expect to cry.
Kathy, thank you. I just want to say I hope that too. My piece of your sharing and Salma's sharing, the first thing that came to mind when that question was asked, Ivy, is I hope our host communities, for all the reasons that are so valid that you really wonder what it means to open your heart and yourself to people you don't know, to tell a story about your community and your people, that the cohort that I think is going to be amazing, all 43 people and more who spoke interest in this, I think would be amazing. My hope is that that host community and the people of your community, Kathy, and your place, and yours, Joe, and yours, Salma, get to feel the humanity and the curiosity of people from other places across our state that they might not have ever felt in passing or even in assumption. We're curious and open and vulnerable. So I'm hopeful for that. I'm hopeful to witness that, and also patient for it, because knowing that's a huge ask until that trust is built and that vulnerability is there. But just because people have been vulnerable through their applications as part of the cohort, as part of our house, that doesn't necessarily dictate that trust then is born. Thank you, Kathy, I want to say. I'll pass to Joe.
Yeah, I was just gonna, I talked to somebody that is in the cohort, and they were talking about, they live rurally here, but it's like, how do we get beyond this, this transactional type of relationship to the urban, or to the, us as rural people, we go to the cities to buy things or to consume things, or to, so we don't really connect to the communities. We're in this shopping zone or going to the movie zone, or, that kind of, and then rural, it's like the urban people come to the rural, it's always about, the nature experience, and so how do we, that's what I would want this to get to, making those deeper relationships. And that's something that I wanted in Mahnomen, is how people connect to the land, and what that means in Minnesota, it's, and what it means for a Native community to be connected to the land, and what is it, how does that, and so I think that that's one thing that, I think we're just so disconnected from nature, that I see, that I think that's one of my little hopes. But I think that's something that, and it's talking about this, I lived 25 years in South Minneapolis, just a few blocks away from where George Floyd was murdered, and living up here. And so I've lived here on the reservation for like 12 years, but I'm still an outsider, I'm still not, considered, a full member of this community. And the people are getting to know me, but I haven't lived here. My family has ties to here, but so I think that just feeling that connecting, and talking to another cohort member that, like, she doesn't feel safe going to the cities. And so, so that to me is like the big thing. I think Selma talked about this and other people. And I actually listened to the earlier cohort webinar, and I remember the young Black man talking about feeling scared to go in rural Kentucky, and I remember that feeling too, driving through South Dakota or rural North Dakota. It's like, can I stop here and go to the bathroom, or so I just, so that's the things that I want to see change. So.
I think everyone worded it so perfectly. I don't have a lot to add. I will keep it brief, but my hope is that, we get to, with this cohort and with this pilot year, I hope that we can get to a place where, like, when I think about RUX, I think about, like, what does it look like to envision a world where everyone can come as they are, and we accept them, right? And we're accepted for being exactly who we are. Now, let me mention the caveat of James Baldwin's quote, where he talks about, we can disagree and still love each other. unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist. I put that in the chat, but I also wanted to name it because it's so powerful. And oftentimes when it comes to like these conversations of, oh, let's work through divides, political divides. Well, how can we do that when my identity is inherently political, right? And a lot of the things that we talk about are, you don't see me as a human being with the right to exist. That I can't come to the table with someone like that. That's a very difficult thing to do. And so I want to name that too. That's oftentimes for people that are, for marginalized people, that burden is placed on them of like, you got to be the bigger person, you got to come to the table, you got to have the conversation. Sometimes I don't want to have the conversation, and like, that's okay too, you know? And that's something I'm learning now. But really my hope for this cohort is, you know, how do we make it so that we all have a stake in dismantling, you know, for example, white supremacy, for example, the global assault on women, for example, like a lot of the things that we brought up today, racism, you know, how I want to get to a place where, you know, I and everyone in our cohort, everyone in our steering committee, no matter if you live in a rural community or an urban community, that you care just as much about what's going on in another community as you do, and maybe even more than you do for like what's happening in your own community, right? Because of this idea of like, we're all interconnected. So if something happens in one part of our place, one part of our state, one part of our home, and even part of our country and our world, right? Like it's something that affects all of us and it has ripple effects. So that's my biggest hope, is for us to get to that place with one another.
I mean, the question is really good, Savannah. I don't know if it'll be terribly different from the core values of Kentucky RUX, but I think for Minnesota RUX, I will tell you that part of what I hope for Minnesota RUX, and this is in part because I'm getting old and I'm feeling some urgency more so. And I think I love the idea of making sure that we're seeing people as who you are and valuing each of us, right? And making sure that people don't feel the way Joe, Salma, and Kathy have felt in communities. But beyond just valuing you as human beings, I have this sense of urgency to transcend and to pass off the power that I know I have, right? And that's why, I mean, that's my sense of urgency. And I don't speak for Teresa and Jane and the other women my age that are part of the RUX planning team, but knowing their souls, I know that their work has always been embedded in trying to transfer and make sure that power does go to individuals who would not have the same sort of opportunities that we have had, even as untraditional leaders like myself. So I say that it's beyond just that seeing you and valuing you. It is transcending and stepping away from those places that I have enjoyed the power. And I think that's an act. It's not just valuing a person. That takes intentional acts to understand that sovereignty and environmental stewardship and racism and all those things that are important, we can recognize those day after day after day and understand the harm and the trauma that's been caused. But until we act and change what's happened, then we stay in this perpetual state that I'm not comfortable in anymore. And so I think even when we started RUX, I said to Anna and Savannah, I need a team member younger than myself, another woman, to be in this with me, because I got asked because of who I am, but she is important and I need to transcend that power that I have to her, and that power of leadership. And so that's what I hope, is that more of us and the future RUX people that hold that space and have that influence and social capital and political capital, that we figure out ways to bring that into other really amazing human beings that otherwise would not. That's what I hope.
Thank you all so much. Gosh, this has just been really, really powerful and deeply moving, honestly, to be a part of this and to sit here with y'all and to have these conversations. I appreciate it so much. Thank you. Thank you for sitting on this panel. So I want to wrap us up here. And I want to just say thank you again to all of y'all for being a part of this and for being so open and vulnerable in this space, and for the work that you're doing in Minnesota. And I want to thank everyone else who joined us today to be here and see this as well. You know, when we started RUX in Kentucky, I'm a founding member, we were feeling a lot of this tension of divides and how people were getting so separated, and you know, getting away from these values of community that so many of us at the time really were invested in. And this has been this feels like a lifetime ago when we started RUX in Kentucky, with everything that's happened since then. And the way that, you know, this country has changed so drastically for so many people in just such a short amount of time. And the way that it has always been this way for so many people for so long. And I, at that time, like, honestly could never have imagined this, you know, the way that y'all have taken this framework that we created over many, many hard conversations and many years, and the way that you are just making it your own, and wrestling, you know, like I said earlier, wrestling with these really hard questions, and how do you want to make sure that you are making all of these things that you just talked about come true. And I'm just so grateful to y'all for being so open to it. And I'm excited to see where it goes. I'll be watching for sure, and excited to hear more about it next year after you welcome folks in and all of that. So I just am so happy and moved by y'all and what you're doing. So I also want to be sure that I thank the National Endowment for the Arts for supporting the RUX Knowledge Building Series, the one in Kentucky, the one that we've just done here with y'all in Minnesota. I also want to thank the Art of the Rural, Apple Shop, and our Minnesota funding partners, including the McNaught Foundation and the St. Paul and Minnesota Foundation. And again, thank you all. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, panelists. It's been such a joy.